Governor Pat Quinn calls for a special legislative session. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Charlie Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS. Charlie, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Jamey.
And Christopher Mooney, Political Science Professor at UIS. Chris, thanks for being here, especially in your state.
Nothing better to do, thank you.
We appreciate it. And Mike Riopell, State House Bureau Chief with the Daily Herald. Mike, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, Jamie.
So as we're taping on Thursday, Governor Pat Quinn has just called a special legislative session for June 19th. He hasn't issued, that we have seen anyway, an official call, but he did issue a press release saying that he wants lawmakers to come back, presumably to address pension reform, which they did not tackle at the end of last week's at the end last week of the regular legislative session. Mike, can you kind of catch us up where we're at and what sort of spurred this call for a special session?
Well, we're at about the same point we were last week, where the Senate and House have passed competing pension proposals. The other side has not passed each other's, and so there is nothing to be sent to Governor Quinn, which is very frustrating to him. He said last year that he was put on God's earth to solve this problem. It's now been more than a year since he has said that. And though much of the bickering is going on in the legislative branch, a lot of the pressure to get something done falls to him in trying to work out a compromise. So now he's called legislators back to Springfield, even though there is no compromise. So there's some question about whether that's worth doing. Are they just going to come here and what are they going to do? What are they even going to talk about? So I guess we'll find out in a couple weeks, but as of right now, they don't have much to talk about besides the ongoing gridlock that remains.
And Charlie, I know we've been over this a lot of times on the show, but for folks who maybe don't remember or haven't seen it, what's the essential argument going on between House Speaker Michael Madigan and Senate President John Cullerton as far as how to tackle this issue?
Well, I think there's basically a philosophical difference between the Speaker and the Senate President over whether or not the Illinois constitutional language saying that membership in a public employee union is a contractual right and that its benefits cannot be diminished or impaired, whether that language would render any legislation to cut benefits unconstitutional. Now, the plan that Speaker Madigan is proposing would substantially reduce benefits for people who are in the four of the 5 retirement systems that the state finances. The plan that Senator President Cullerton is advancing is one that would offer employees a choice. His argument is that because it's a contract, it can't be unilaterally changed. However, if I offer you, Wheeler, a choice and you accept it, then the constitutional language doesn't cover it. And the choice is accept reduced benefits, keep state subsidized health insurance, or keep your current pension plan, lose state subsidized health insurance. And that's where the two sides are kind of in opposition, if you will. That's the philosophical difference. And some of it gets caught up in personalities. As long as I've watched this stuff, and it goes back a long time, there's always this institutional tension between the House and the Senate. And this is the kind of problem that kind of exacerbates things. And from my perspective, Quinn calling a special session is really showboating, grandstanding, flailing about. And I say that for a couple reasons. One, if you call a special session, you have to pay the lawmakers per diem when they come here. On the other hand, if they just come back in normal session, we, the taxpayers, don't have to cover those expenses. Now, if there is no agreement, then it's just a waste of time and money to bring them back. If there is an agreement, then you don't need the special session, because when both houses adjourned on May 31st, they adjourned basically until when the Senate President and or the House Speaker tell them to come back in normal session. So if there is an agreement, they can just bring them back and do it. And if not, you're wasting time and money.
Well, Governor Quinn's predecessor was a fan of special sessions, and we saw Governor Quinn call a special session on pension reform last summer with nothing coming out of it. Chris, I mean, what's to be gained here for Governor Quinn, and what kind of risk is he taking by doing this?
Well, God only knows what he's thinking about. Because this is a story, this is a movie we've seen play out for the last decade, as you've said. And all it serves to do, typically, is annoy the General Assembly, gives editorial boards of newspapers a chance to rail about the money that's being spent, and then lawmakers sit around for a while, complain, oh, my trip to Disneyland, it has to get canceled because they have to come down to Springfield, and it makes them, and that doesn't make them look good either, for that very reason, because they look like some whiners. So and nothing gets done. The time, special sessions in general, especially in the state of Illinois, are not a place for deliberation and discussion of especially extended problems. That's what the regular legislative session is for. And also negotiations, behind the scenes. Special sessions are best used for ratification of agreements that are worked out in advance. And especially in a sense, this particular issue, the pension issue, it would be tailor-made for that use of a special session if you've got an agreement, because everybody knows what the issues are. We've known what the issues are really for 12 months, 18 months. There's different points of view. If the governor could get in the same room with Cullerton and Madigan, and it's not just those two, those three guys, but they sort of epitomize what's going on. But there's a lot of interest. You've got the union interest. You've got the commercial club and the rich people in Chicago, editorial boards and whatnot. Different interests involved there. But they sort of epitomize it. And if they could get together and work this out somehow, then you could bring people back down to Springfield and pass the thing through. But by putting this deadline, basically, sort of a 2 weeks. Look, in 2 weeks we're going to have this. They haven't. He's been setting deadlines for the past 18 months to no avail. Why should we think that this is going to happen in 2 weeks? Especially because just last week he tried to have a meeting with the Speaker and the President, and he couldn't get the Speaker to show up. In fact, he even knew the Speaker wasn't going to be there, and he held the meeting anyway just to gratuitously annoy the Speaker. And now he's going to call this, and he's going to gratuitously annoy the General Assembly.
Well, while both chambers have passed their own version of pension reform, it seems like the strategy right now is possibly to put pressure on Senate President John Cullerton to call the House version. Mike, why is that, and is it justified? Senate President John Cullerton is arguing that his bill could easily pass in the House. Will we see that happen? Yeah,
the people who want Cullerton to pass the Madigan preferred bill like it because it, in theory, would save the state more money. The state pension problem is very large. We know that. It's $100 billion plus. The amount the state has to pay every year grows, which is a real pressure on the budget every year. But the problem with doing that is in their last week of session, the Senate killed that bill pretty handily. It wasn't close. It got 16 votes, I believe. It needed 30. If that's the plan for the special session, is to try and move that bill again, that might be difficult. One of the jokes around the State House was, okay, on Thursday, this vote happened, it got killed, but it could come up again on Friday. And some people were saying, well, they could just kill it 5 more times on Friday.
Like Rasputin.
Right. It was defeated so handily that it's hard to imagine it resurrecting itself.
And in fact, wasn't a similar bill voted on a couple months earlier in the
right.
Senate?
And it
actually got more votes that time.
It got 23 votes, 7 votes short in March. It lost 7 votes by May, and now people are trying to get it called. What if it lost 7 more? Who knows? It's going the wrong direction.
Zero, and you can't go any further.
It's going the wrong direction. People still want some provisions in that plan to survive and go into any compromise, because those are the kinds of things. Cutting back, annual cost of living adjustments and pensions, for example, is one way to save a lot of money. Some people want those kind of provisions in an eventual bill, but that particular bill is not looking to be in good shape at the moment.
And again, it goes back, I think, and there's a lot been made of the politics, but I think there are lawmakers who seriously believe it's not in our best interest to pass something that probably won't stand up to constitutional muster, because all that does is mean we'll be back in a year or two facing the same kind of problem, which is why Cullerton came up with this idea that, as I said before, I can agree voluntarily to give up some of my pension rights, but I won't let the state unilaterally take them away from me. And as a matter of fact, that's the reason why that language is in the Constitution. If you go back and read the transcripts of the Constitutional Convention debates, the issue was raised. If we put this in the Constitution, won't that mean that in the future the legislature can't take away some of these benefits? And the sponsors of that particular provision said, in essence, well, yeah, duh, that's the whole reason we want that in there.
Well, and there's another issue that complicates this during a special session, and that's kind of a timeline issue of how many votes would be needed for this to go into effect quickly. Charlie, can you kind of run us through what happens once we pass that adjournment deadline?
Yeah, the Constitution says that in the first 5 months of a calendar year, the General Assembly can pass legislation and say, or set any effective date they want, either right this minute or 10 minutes from the time the governor signs it or 2 weeks from the time the governor signs it, with a simple majority. And if they don't say anything, it becomes effective the following January 1st. In the last 7 months of the calendar year, if the General Assembly wants to pass something and have it take effect right away, once it's signed, it requires an extraordinary majority, 3/5 votes in both chambers. And so in terms of the pensions, if the General Assembly were to pass something next week in the special session with just a simple majority and not the 3/5, by law, it would not take effect until the following June 1st. Now, the way around that, of course, is to come back, pass it in June and say, okay, it's not going to be effective to next June, come back in January, pass another piece of legislation that in essence sets an immediate effective date, which you could do with a simple majority.
And by then you'd have everybody on board and
Yeah.
everybody's on record.
Or even the people who voted for it in June, they're probably going to vote for it in January.
That's right.
So that's a way around
But
that.
even that, I mean, that's such a minor, 6 months. So what? I mean, it's been 18 months, 20 years, whatever you want to count it, that they've been working on this
Yeah.
issue. So.
Yeah, it seems to be another thing that folks are pointing to that are frustrated. Senate President John Cullerton brought it up at the end of session. So, as Charlie said, there may be a way around it, but it also seems to be a way for people to perhaps stall a little longer if there isn't something.
And another issue that came up right at the end of the session, it had been out there but hadn't gotten much attention. The depth of the cuts that the Madigan proposal, which is backed by the business interests in Chicago, and by a lot of the Republicans, the depth of those cuts for teacher retirement benefits are so great that it may run afoul of the federal law that allows school districts not to have to pay Social Security. If the benefits under the teacher's retirement system are less than what a teacher would get in Social Security, then the employer, the school district, has to pay the Social Security tax, which I believe is 6.2% of payroll. And so kind of hidden in there is the fact that, hey, if this does go through with these deep cuts, we could be saddling the school districts with this substantial new cost in the future, because by and large, school districts outside Chicago don't pay anything for their teachers' retirement benefits. And the sponsor of the Madigan plan, not the sponsor, it's Madigan's the sponsor, one of the chief architects and one of the lead negotiators, Representative Elaine Nickritz from the north suburbs, said, well, yeah, that could be a problem, but that's on down the line. What did she say? It'd be like 10 years or something?
Right, and yeah, we could find a way to work through that, and they've said the same thing about what's known as Tier 2, which are the people hired after January 1st, 2011 or something like. They say those benefits as well that were enacted a while back are not generous enough, that people are paying more into retirement that they will eventually get back, could be eligible for Social Security, so that would be a problem down the line. Then to have it applied to this bill that covers everybody becomes an even bigger problem.
Another thing that points out is the fact that one of the bigger draws for public service historically, and especially since World War II, has been number one, job security, and also pension. that if you work, you're a teacher, you make relatively low pay for your education, or you work in whatever job in state government, and you don't get paid that highly during your working life, but you've got a steady job, and you're not going to get fired, generally speaking, except for cause, and you're going to have a pension that's relatively comfortable. Now, if these cuts go into effect and it puts us at risk of being less than Social Security. Social Security was never intended to be a serious pension. Basically, it's a safety net so that old people don't starve, right? Mm-hmm. And that shows you the depth that they're cutting this, and that's something that really hasn't been talked about too much. But it's going to be significant for recruitment down the road.
And overall, I mean, it is a really complicated thing, and I just think the way I try to explain it just goes to show how complicated this is, that the idea that you could cut benefits to save money and end up having to spend more in the long run just shows how complicated this is. It just goes against your conventional wisdom, which is what this debate is so complicated that, that just shows how complicated it is.
Well, and the bottom line is because that just shows that they're having, if we get down to the Social Security level, that means that the state is going to have to pay the same amount, is going to basically be giving the same amount as somebody working at McDonald's or some other job where they don't actually have a pension system and all they have is Social Security, and that the state, even at that low level, is not being able to afford it. And the reason is because they haven't paid for the last 20 years or 50 years or 60 years, right, what they're supposed to be paying. And so now we're catching up with it.
Well, another piece of legislation that folks were hoping to see passed at the end of the regular session was a bill to legalize same-sex marriage in the state, but that bill wasn't called for a vote. Mike, I know you covered that. Can you just tell us a little bit about it and give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was all week, and especially Friday, the last day of session. Depending on who you asked, it was either obviously going to be voted on in the House or it clearly wasn't going to be. And it came down to Friday, and it wasn't looking good for a vote to be called. And the way you could tell is that they hired some last-minute lobbyists. They were having union lobbyists lobby for same-sex marriage. It was a real desperation last minute. Let's try and use the deadline to get it passed. It came down to the last couple, minutes, half-hour session. And Greg Harris, the sponsor of it, had to get up and say, we don't have the votes. People have told me that maybe if we try in November, we can give it a shot. There were many same-sex marriage advocates in the gallery screaming, call it for a vote, call it for a vote. The political wisdom is that it was probably, if you want to get it done long-term, it was probably the right thing to do to not have a vote. And the reason is, if you have a vote and it fails by 2 or 3, let's say, now you have to publicly try and flip-flop 2 or 3 people on a very controversial issue. And it's probably easier to do that behind closed doors, as they have been doing it behind closed doors to try and gain momentum to where they are now. On the other hand, you can imagine the frustration. You've been, trying to work. Even in lame duck session, there was some talk, maybe it could get done, it didn't. So then there was a thought, there's veto-proof majorities in both chambers. Of Democrats, it's in their national platform. If you're especially a national advocate who doesn't understand Illinois politics, you would think that'd be easy, And they've shown it's still very controversial. They'll try in the fall, and some people have said it's no question it'll happen in the fall. I think it remains a question until there's an actual vote.
And I think had they taken a roll call and had not gotten enough, it would make it more difficult in the future, because you would have some people who would vote for it and be hung out to dry. It's easier to vote for something that passes and defend it than to vote for something that doesn't get through and be there for the opponents to take shots at you. And also, once it got to 60, there would be other people, I think, who would jump on. But I think Representative Harris made the right decision not to call the bill, because I've never seen that it's to an advantage to somebody on such a controversial issue to call it before it's ready to pass and leave people hanging.
And it's been very clear, I cover some people who have either been on the fence, or both the Republicans who have publicly been for it in the House or from the suburbs, face big-time rallies at their district offices. The two Republicans who've been for it have faced big rallies at their offices, plus public letters from religious leaders and et cetera, et cetera. And then other people like Linda Chapalavia, for example, from Aurora, she's a Democrat, has been undecided, has faced dueling rallies at her district office on weekends. You know, both sides get there. So it's pretty clear why it's tough, you know, for some of these people who are on the fence or maybe bucking the party on either side. I mean, Democrats bucking the party, Republicans bucking the party, getting tons and tons of pressure, and probably will also, now that Harris has kind of said publicly, we're looking at a November vote, I think you can see that pressure continuing all summer.
Yeah, this is one of the fastest moving issues that we've seen in state politics, you know, in a generation. It's amazing to me how we've gotten as far as we have. And what that means is that there are some people, citizens groups, who are moving faster than others on it. And it's clear where the momentum of this issue is going, at least in many states. I think in general, it's public opinion is moving in favor of it. Is it going to happen in Mississippi anytime soon? Probably not. But it's probably going to happen in Illinois. You know, I would suggest this time next year it'll be done one way or the other. But it takes a while to get people there. And the internal dynamics of the Democratic Party, especially with the conservative black churches, which would putting pressure on the Black Caucus, which is a very important faction of the Democratic Party in the General Assembly, they were putting the brakes on this thing, and with an emotional, moral, fast-moving issue like this, you can't force people into it. You know, you can't browbeat them with a new school, or you can't embarrass them into it. They have to come to it on their own, and I think I'm sure that they will, but it's just going to be a little more time, and the frustration is palpable on Friday with proponents, but as Charlie said, Greg Harris did the right thing. So.
Well, and I think there's a certain inevitability, at least if you look at the survey results, it suggests that people my age don't think it's a good idea. People you guys' age say, what's the big deal? And just in the inevitability of time, pretty soon people who think the way you do will be the ones calling the shots, and people thinking like me will be watching down from up above, hopefully.
Rolling in your grave, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it should be said, I mean, the flip side of what we're talking about, the fact that Illinois is such a blue state and it didn't happen was a big victory, I think, nationally for people who oppose same-sex marriage. I mean, in the same way that, there were a couple states that went to same-sex marriage. I think Minnesota was among them, while Illinois' bill was in the House, and the fact that they put off a vote anyway, I think, was a big victory for them.
Albeit maybe a temporary one.
Right,
but,
perhaps, yeah.
So we've seen a lot of recent developments for the Republican Party. We've just got a little bit of time left, but Mike, can you run us through some of the things that have been going on as far as new candidates, a new leader?
Yeah, just this weekend, the Republicans replaced Pat Brady as their chairman. Pat Brady was a businessman who was chairman for several years, replaced Annie McKenna, started lobbying for same-sex marriage, started lobbying Republicans. There was a pushback because that's against the party platform. He was not ousted because of that. He was able to withstand a couple votes to try and oust him, but then quit like a week later after he survived the vote. So Republicans this weekend picked Jack Dorgan, who's a lobbyist, has some big clients, AT&T, Ameren, some other clients. He's a trustee up in the village of Rosemont, up in the suburbs. And he has gotten some criticism from the more conservative, side of the party because his candidates, because as a lobbyist, he's often has to play both sides of the aisle. On the other hand, he seems very organized. He came, his pitch to the state central committee was, I have a staff in place, ready to go. I have a plan. So He won with about 60% of the vote over Jim Nalepa, a businessman from the suburbs as well, who is the more conservative favored candidate. So he's got a big job ahead of him. 2014 is a big year for the Republican Party. They really need the governor's mansion. They'd like to flip back some of those congressional seats in particular. The map is working against them, but the governor's race in particular, that's got to be his focus. I think.
And we saw 2 people step forward for that. We got just a couple minutes left. Can you give us a little rundown on 2 of the Republican hopefuls?
Yeah, Dan Rutherford, the treasurer, has stepped in officially. Bruce Rauner, a wealthy businessman from Chicago or Wilmette, depending on which address he's using.
Which of his homes
right.
drives on the other two.
So he has stepped in officially. Then both Bill Brady and Kirk Dillard said, both state senators, Bill Brady from Bloomington, Kirk Dillard from Hinsdale, have both said they're going to announce this summer. So even though they haven't technically yet, we basically have a 4-person race. Dillard and Brady were the top 2 finishers in 2010. How will primary voters feel about them again? Rutherford is very energetic, a very hard worker. Rauner, I think is how we say it, has a lot of money to spend on advertising. So it will be a very spirited race. There's no doubt about that.
Well, and we'll have to leave it at that for this week. I'd like to thank my guests, Charlie, Chris, and Mike. Thank you for being here, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next time.